we have sort of been meandering about the pathways of history. I'm trying to find out if my voice is okay or not.
It's good.
Yeah.
All right, good. And while doing so, it certainly occurred to me that once you take several looks at the past, it certainly might be a good idea to take one at the future if you are able to do so. Because, of course, there is always a discrepancy between the two. A very nice gentleman who was sort of my mentor here in the 1950s, was the lodge president, a medical doctor, a very nice man, Dr. William Abt, God rest his soul. Now I want you to know he was a long-time vegetarian, but he is the one who weaned me from vegetarianism. He said, son, what you're eating is not agreeing with you. You understand? You got to eat such and such, you'll be, and he was right. So anyway, that's just a good indication that a man's dedication to his medical profession outweighed other allegiances. In any event, why I brought that up, I really don't know, but it seemed like a good idea at the time. However, to continue with the little introduction, I think what I was leading toward was that once we have taken so many views of the past, which of course is always easier to do because they have happened already and you have some evidence indicating that they have happened, but with the future that is not the case. But that certainly, as far as we are able to do, it would be to our advantage to try to cast a few glances at the future, in this case, of the future in the light of the esoteric tradition. And in that regard, probably because of my own preoccupations of the last number of decades, I immediately thought of the prophetic role of Carl Jung. While Jung, of course, was primarily known and rightfully as one of the at least three, maybe the two earliest and greatest teachers and practitioners of depth psychology, he was a man, as we have come to discover over the years, a man of many talents. I'm always reminded of a little incident that a lady unknown to me said to me on I don't know, was it on a train or something like that. Anyway, I was going to a little burg in towards San Diego called Escondido, and so the lady started talking to me, and so I mentioned to her that I was probably my talk was about Jung, and she said, "Oh, that's interesting," says, because I encountered him and the Jung phenomenon in Zurich. I said, "Well, tell me about it." So in Zurich, like in so many alpine towns, you have a lake. You have mountains, then you have waters. And so, just like the town where I lived for almost 7 years, in Hallstatt in Upper Austria, if you arrive with the train, you get out of the train and then you get into a ferry boat. And then you go across the lake, and on the other side is the town of Hallstatt, which was, I always thought, a very romantic way of arriving among all the swans that are swimming around and so forth. But anyway, in Zurich, so she said, she got into the ferry boat and was going over to the other side, and there was only one person in the room, the cabin, whatever you call it, There was a gentleman with a white mustache and chewing on a pipe. And so then when they got off, even though they didn't speak, she was sort of impressed by his presence. So she asked the man on the boat, who was that impressive-looking gentleman? And he said, wissen Sie denn das nicht? Das ist der Dr. Jung, unser alter Hexenmeister. He said, don't you know that? That is Dr. Jung, our old wizard. So that was the local nickname among the Swiss in Zurich. Now then, that being the case, let us say it is fairly well known to almost anybody who finds his or her way here that I have been preoccupied with Jung for a long, long time, and that is really strictly about him and his teachings that not that any of my books were a great success, but they were a moderate success in their own genre. The Gnostic Jung and the Seven Sermons to the Dead, which was my first book published in America, and then Jung and the Lost Gospels. These obviously all concerned Jung. There's a third one that I wrote that was a little bit Jungian also, and that's freedom, alchemy for some kind of a society, I don't know what, liberty-loving society, which also is full of quotations from Jung. In any event, the reason for that being that just on the basis of the then available, somewhat scanty stock of literature, all in German, but of course that was my second native language, we found some of the writings of C.G. Jung, and that really when it comes to sort of let's say the borderline writers who write about various subjects but also subsume the esoteric tradition, among these writers certainly Jung was already an outstanding figure. And so the Austrian lady who traveled to Zurich and who there heard them say that this is our old witch doctor, our Hexenmeister, which just really means the old wizard, was apparently telling the truth. Now, that being the case, it is no coincidence that it is in Jung's opus, which is just Latin for work, If you want to sound very learned and very multilingual, then instead of saying work, you say opus, And if it's a little work, then you can say opusculum, a little work. In any event, apparently that this was a truthful rumor, and so as time went on, fairly early in my life, while I was still attending the philosophical faculty, over there we call them faculties. What they call a department here in academia is called a faculty there. So at the philosophical faculty of the university, while I was there, I heard more and more interesting stories and got more literature from the pen of the old wizard of Zurich, and this became more and more interesting to me until a certain incident which stands off by itself and which became the source really of my, at least the inspiration to my first book on Jung, on Jung and the Gnostic Jung, which depicted there and this was a then unpublished manuscript, which around that time Jung had made a private printing of it, and which was entitled The Seven Sermons to the Dead, to which he gave a Latin title, Septem Sermones ad Mortuos. The Latin and Greek were still very much the academic language when I went to school, of course at the upper level. And so I was happy that in my pre-university education I had no less than 8 years of Latin, and I had about 4 years of Greek, 2 years of Hebrew, and I don't know, no Enochian, I'm sorry to say. So in any event, that was really the beginning of my thoroughly intense interest in Jung, and the reasons for it were twofold. One, that the particular manuscript that was lent to me, of which I was the proud possessor for one night. So it is Austrian and Hungarian generosity. Yeah, we'll let you see it, but only for one night. In any event. So that was Jung's little treatise written right during World War I, entitled The Seven Sermons to the Dead. And of course the reason that I was attracted to it once I read it, actually the reason why it was presented to me to begin with, because I already had a burning desire for all things Gnostic, which I acquired early in childhood and which just grew bigger and bigger. So that being the case, it's all described in the introduction of the book, that I stayed up all night and copied the German text with the Latin title all down on my own papers, and then subsequently I translated the German. When I came here, I translated it into English, and eventually it resulted in the publication of the Gnostic Jung and the Seven Sermons to the Dead. And the very important matter about it to me was that I immediately discerned, which was not difficult to do, that this was written almost entirely. That's not it's the first part of my book with the same title, but it indicated that this man was extremely interested in, perhaps even fascinated by, the same subject that I was, namely Gnosticism. And so that was really the beginning of my career with Jungian matters. And now, the reason, of course, I brought that up, because the only person in some manner associated with the esoteric tradition, the current esoteric movement, or the esoteric movement of some time ago, who had actually made some pretty distinct and definite prophecies of a future predicting nature, of all the people who have written. Blavatsky has one sort of offhand sentence somewhere in. I'm trying to recall it, and undoubtedly will distort it in my geriatric memory. It says that in the century the 20th, when many things will have changed, there may come someone else who can continue in his own way what I have started. And she placed a certain amount of credence in that future development. And that certainly I should not forget. And to it was added a sort of run-off sentence. And of course, this will be of great interest to all psychologists. Now, you know, psychology in the last years of the 19th century, when she had to write that, why? Because she died. Indicated that it was a branch of philosophy. When William James, the noted American philosopher, was really a very fine thinker and very fine writer. When William James wrote, he indicated that that psychology was a branch of psychology. No, psychology was a branch of philosophy, and that he was a philosopher. He didn't consider himself anything else. A very interesting gentleman, and in any event, he was acquainted with the earliest psychologists, C.G. Jung and Sigmund Freud. Have met him in Worcester, Massachusetts, a nice little New England town where I have also spent a sleepless night at one time, the circumstances of which shall not be disclosed. But let's say it's a nice place, and there is a private university there, I'm trying to think of the name of it, which gave all of these persons, Freud, Jung, and William James, an honorary degree at that time. So in any event, philosophy or something else, and it was really then in the very last days of the 19th century, when Sigmund Freud was finishing his book on the interpretation of dreams, that psychoanalysis as a new discipline was established. Freud always hoped, because he was from that era, that people are going to call it the new science. And this is what dear old Sigmund Freud was meditating about till he died of cancer in London in exile after he had been ransomed from the Nazis by a member of a royal family, by Princess Marie Bonaparte, who was one of the descendants of the Napoleonic dynasty, and a great and very accomplished psychoanalyst. Freud trained Princess Marie in psychoanalysis, and she was very worshipful of Freud. And then came the Nazis, and so the princess came to Vienna and then to Berlin, and she negotiated with the Nazis day after day after day as to how she could get Freud out. And finally she did. You guessed it, with money. But in any event, all of this works sort of into the background of this situation, that Jung was already, no doubt, as we say in Latin, sub rosa, underneath the rose. He was already very interested in esotericism and particularly in Gnosticism. But his interest, especially in the Gnostics, in my old friends, only came out in the 1920s when he privately published the little booklet, The 7 Sermons to the Dead, and it had a subtitle, Latin title, German title. In any event, it also has a poetic ascription of authorship that written in the city of Alexandria, where East meets the West. but of course that is purely poetic license. So in any event, that was sort of what launched my career in the direction of Jung, to whom I was very sympathetic already, and certainly further into Gnosticism. Now, I was once sternly, maybe not reprimanded, but at least corrected by my friend. He's still alive, I almost said late, I hope that is not true, Robert Elwood, who was for many years the head of the Department of Religion at USC, a very, very fine gentleman. In fact, he said in public, so I don't mind repeating it in a bragging manner, that he joined the Theosophical Society purely because of moi. So, what the heck, he's a very good man, he's an excellent scholar, and everything that he did in or outside the Theosophical Society redounded to the benefit of all who had anything to do with it. Very fine man. He's I think a little bit older than I, which is unusual. Is anyone as old as I? But in any event, he lives now in the neighborhood of Claremont, where one of his daughters teaches in the Claremont colleges. Very nice fellow. So in any event, how did I get over on that? Well, because he said such nice things about me, and you know, it's very strange, but you hardly ever forget the people who say good things about you. And yet you so easily forget the people who say bad things about you. Maybe there is a profound psycho-spiritual reason that this wise assembly might discover. And if you do, you will reveal them to me, so I have another feather in my non-existent cap. In any event, now, it was Dr. Elwood who instructed me once that the term prophet does not necessarily, or even to a minor degree, denote someone who foretells the future. That is a modern addition to the word, but that a prophet is, in religious studies, which of course we both practice, is a prophet is someone who talks with God. And it probably the first religious leader called a prophet was Zarathustra, who started the Zoroastrian religion. And he's usually referred to us as the great Zarathustra or the prophet Zarathustra. And this professor was also of the opinion that the prophetic calling is something that is probably related to and goes back to the early shamans of various so-called primitive cultures, because they talk with the spirits, with the gods, with the great spirit or whatever, and so they have that particular connection with the greater reality. And that later on, when monotheism became important, beginning with Zarathustra, continuing with Judaism, and then ultimately continuing with Muhammad. So that when these people came along, then it became gradually more and more kind of confused a little bit. Well, he prophesied, and you imagine that he foretold the beginning of World War II or something, and that's not necessarily true. So it's really a person with an unusual connection with the non-physical realm, who takes it upon himself to a greater or lesser extent to voice these insights and communication that may have come to him from a greater source. And so that is why I said that the only person whom I would consider in the proper sense of the term a prophet was, in modern times, C.G. Jung. Now, why do I say that? Certainly how many, I have all of them, if nobody stole one of them by now, but the 16 volumes of Jung's collected writings, there isn't one that talks about the future. But there is a book that he never published, and that was published subsequently, I think, primarily for financial gain, but isn't that why we publish books so often? By his family, and that came to be called the Red Book. Das Rote Buch, simply because of a description. It was in his, from beginning to end, in his handwriting, in beautiful German calligraphy, and and the one copy that was extant was in beautiful gold-stamped red leather, and still is. It has been exhibited here in Los Angeles too. And so, for expediency, he called it das Rote Buch, the red book. So, in that red book, when it finally was published many years after his death, then really caused quite a bit of excitement, primarily in Jungian circles, to some extent in esoteric circles, but I was sort of the banner bearer to begin with, who tried to make people available. Look, guys, this was not only a psychologist, but that this was actually an esotericist. He was tremendously familiar with the esoteric tradition, and he had a vision that went sort of the source of both, the source of the esoterica and the source of psychology, which he recognized as being a common field of endeavor, which he usually called by the somewhat prosaic name the unconscious. In German, das Unbewusste, which in some of the new thought practitioners in the USA have changed that around and made it into what? In any event, the subconscious. The term subconscious is not a legitimate psychological appellation. Now, of course, you are free to name things anything, you know. You are free to name a Dachshund the German Shepherd, but you know what? The Dachshund is still not going to change into the German Shepherd. I have more experience with Dachshunds than with German Shepherds, but they never did change. So this was really of great importance, because the kind of depth psychology, that was a legitimate term, that the psychology of Jung then came to be known as, was to begin with a little bit of a disguised hybrid of the occult and of depth psychology. You see, Sigmund Freud was a typical 19th century gentleman, a very interesting man. I earned my living once for 2.5 years by collecting material on his biography for the then very well-known American historical novelist Irving Stone, whom I will be always grateful, because he really introduced me into the literary world in the United States, and that was a great thing. But aside from that, let us say what Jung really developed, and fairly early, I was never good with numbers, but I think after about 1913, when he wrote and published his book on symbols of transformation, as it is called in English, it has other sorts of titles in others, but which really had to do in many ways about the incredibly wide symbolism of the human psyche and the relationship of that symbolism, especially to such disciplines as the to such disciplines as psychoanalysis, but also to related ancillary fields such as mythology, religious philosophy, religious scriptures, comparative religion, and so forth. All of which were made old Papa Freud, and he's not only a fellow Austrian, but he's also a fellow cigar smoker, which I respect, greatly. Papa Freud did not take this new symbiotic relationship, of course, of psychoanalysis with mystical and occult and mythological matters very kindly, because he tried to keep the two separate, although I well remember from my studies of his life when I was writing about him in Vienna I still remember some things. Old age doesn't completely destroy your memory. At 39, number 39 Berggasse in Vienna was Freud's office and living quarters. That's the way that often went at that time. And so there he had, on the ground floor was his reception room. I think there was a sort of room for a secretary if he had one, and so forth. And then the famous room with the couch, the beginning of the Freudian couch, which has never really gone into obscurity. But you know why it was there? What was the real reason? Of course, Freud would not own up to that, because he started his practice with hypnosis. He was first a hypnotist, and it was very common, and still is, that when you're being hypnotized, you recline, and then the hypnotist sits down or walks around, or they don't tweak your nose, or whatever is around. But that the couch remains, and it's still a standard fixture in a Freudian psychologist, or what else we call it, the psychoanalytic office. But that was not a problem. You see, the problem was that Freud was an offspring of a materialistic era, the 19th century, which C.G. Jung later on said the 19th century was the true dark ages of Europe. Now I'm sure that there are a lot of people in universities or so who didn't like that statement, but you can see why, because it was the time when a tendency which Gerald Heard, the British exile American philosopher, called the era of scientism. Scientism is not the same as science. So the sciences, individual sciences, are legitimate disciplines within their own purview. But on the other hand, when people of scientific orientation arrogate to themselves the right to pontificate about subjects which are not part of their chosen scientific discipline, that I think is deplorable. And it always happens. And you know where it happens in the most tremendous and most devastating way during the COVID epidemic. That's when it happened. You know? Oh, you got to follow the science. Oh yes, where does the science follow me? So you know, you got to be careful with these things. And these are actually survivors of the 19th century. I am a scientist, in medicine or in physics or in, I don't know what, in the treatment of boils on your body or whatever. I am a scientist and therefore I know. Well, you may know something, but when you assume that you know all, then you have outstepped really your stride. And this needs to be kept in mind, because there was a time when it was firmly believed by, let's say, most of the important people, or at least the people who considered themselves important, which is always the case. Other people may not share that view, but yes, more. But in any event, you know, they thought that the world was moving into an era of total scientific orientation, and that really all of its lifeblood would come out of the science, especially the physical sciences, and that would herald a new era of scientific orientation, of an objective mentality, and at the same time an eclipse of such things as art, philosophy, religion, anthropology, and so forth. That was the hope of a certain class of people in the 19th century. But then times changed, and already by the time that the clocks were striking in Vienna, in St. Stephan's Dome, St. Stephan's Church has a great, magnificent clock. By the time they were striking New Year's of the year 1900, it had already changed. And it changed primarily because of a handsome, slender, bearded Jewish gentleman who whenever possible had his lovely, short but very pungent cigars in his mouth, and whose name was Dr. Sigmund Freud. Because he said, yes, we are bringing a new science, but whether you call it a science or not, but we know what it is. And if it does not respond to your personal requirements for science, then forget it. It is a sort of science, and we are promoting it as such, and it's going to help people, and it's going to heal people, and it's going to be just great. And on he went. He was a very determined, but also very honest gentleman, and he knew what he was talking about. And the only real difference, both in their approach and in the scientific or philosophical theories themselves, between himself and the little stocky, short, pipe-smoking, and I also have to bring in the sacred herb of the American Indians. I assure you that I only bring it in because of my great regard for Native America. if you believe that, then you believe anything. In any event, these two, but particularly Freud, who was out in front, had, with his publication of his first great chef-d'oeuvre, his chief work, The Interpretation of Dreams, he revived an ancient occult art of dream interpretation, which only magicians and witches and so forth have been practicing before, but he gave it a scientific veneer. And he created a theory that, and I am not a professional in that field, but let's say I could not disagree with I had to, for my livelihood at that time, I had to read every paragraph and every chapter in the collected works of Sigmund Freud. And man, there are many of them. I remember Mr. Stone and I walked into the bookstore in Beverly Hills, and there was a special bookstore there that sold primarily, maybe exclusively, to the psychological profession, because there are so many psychoanalysts and their kids and kin in Beverly Hills. That's why they can live there. You know, we don't have to go into details. But let us say that was there, and it was really on minor, what I would consider to be details of the depth psychological field that they began to disagree. And as I remember, well, I have a great deal of regard for Freud, and when I got through writing, I got through reading all that he wrote, and I was a walking, talking Freud machine. But let's say I really got to liking the old man. And then I actually encountered a few people who knew him personally, one my countryman and a naughty New York psychoanalyst, subsequently Dr. Nando Fodor, who also earned his laurels probably primarily by psychical research, and the psychology of psychical research, all that stuff, ghosts and table tapping and all this. Very, very fine gentleman. And here, he spent hours with Freud. And then there was, I take off on these tangents. I don't know, there should be a red flag or something. I don't like a red flag. I don't like what red flag stood for in the past. You can present me with a red, white, and green flag. There would be Italy and Hungary, both only arranged differently. Anyway, the red flag having been that Jung felt, and it was absolutely a feeling. Jung had a feeling that there was more to this field, that there was more to this new science, to this discipline, whatever you want to call it, than Freud came forth with. They said, yes, Freud was right, but he only went so long. And then he began to offer evidence of other material in the psyche, in the soul, and its effect on people's life, on their thinking, on their feeling, on their professions, and so forth. And that was really the reason for the two of them departing. Now, of course, Jung already gave evidence to Freud of his, namely Jung's own interest in the occult. He never concealed it. When he went, I don't know, the early times when he went to Vienna, it's not so terribly far from Zurich to Vienna. I would say a a real nice long Churchill-sized cigar should be enough if you are smoking it on the way. It's not very far. In any event, he went to see Dr. Freud, and they had a nice conversation. And then Freud, in his real sort of Viennese mythologizing, poeticizing mode, said, well, you know, Jung, but one thing I'm really afraid of is that our discipline, our new science, will be eaten up by the black tide of occultism. Now, those were fighting words, because Jung had an entirely different view based on his experience of things in that black tide, while Freud did not. So he was still very polite, and he said, well, Dr. Freud, you know, we all have our points of view and everything. But he said, you know, Dr. Freud, if you really look into these things, as I have, you will find that these strange things that the spiritualists and various other occultists practice, that these things really happen. You know, it's not just made up, it really happens. And so Freud said, what do you mean? What do you mean, Jung? Well, he says, you know, for instance, that, you know, one of the very important phenomena is knocking on the knocks in the room, you know, spirit raps and things like that. I always thought that they should have a spiritualist hymn. When these knocks start, then the medium should sing, I hear you knocking, but you can't come in. Not a very good idea, but it's the best one I had at the moment. So, in any event, and so Jung said practically that. He said, no, Dr. Freud, moreover, there is going to be some of that happening here right now. And Freud looked up, what do you mean? What do you mean, Jung? And boom, 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 in Freud's big bookcase in his office, which I'm sure was big because he was a great reader, there the knocks came. And Freud got up and he walked around and he looked around. And he went up to Jung and he said, Jung, I don't know how you do these things, but please quit it, please stop it. And Jung said, of course, Dr. Freud, if you want me to, I will. But let's see, he made his point, so to say. And so while these were not the great significant issues, they indicated a different orientation. Jung wanted to explore more. Jung felt that there was a great deal of important material still there, and that it came from the human psyche. It didn't have to come from grandma or from grandpa who were sleeping in the cemetery in Vienna, but they came somehow from the human psyche, whether alive or dead, and that it should be recognized. Well, that already did not please old Dr. Freud. And then, you know, when you have two very prominent people in a movement, which the psychoanalytic movement was, because all of a sudden doctors, medical doctors everywhere, from America to Bombay to various European countries, all of a sudden they all were buying couches and they were following the new science. And so, you know, because this was a new thing. And so, let us say, then really Freud and Jung sort of branched apart. But what, of course, was only partially known, really only to those who were closer to Jung, was that Jung had a very, very wide view, and that he was tremendously interested in ancient mythology. He was tremendously interested in religious studies. He was tremendously interested in all the, let's say, the borderline disciplines where spirit and soul and body meet. I'm sure that if somebody would have asked him, why are you so interested in that stuff, Dr. Jung? He would have said, why? Because it's so fascinating. Because it's about the only really interesting thing in this world. Why should I be interested in something else? This is really, really interesting. Now I'm channeling Jung, of course. In any event, that was the divergence. Now, what else? The reason I brought that up, Jung was a prophetic figure. And so we always expected, here and there in his many, many books, there would be little indications that he says something, well, in the next century there might be some discovery, some this and that, but he was very, very cautious about it. Because, of course, his writings, his books, which were, at least in the English language, were all published by Princeton University and so forth, they were accessible to the academic community, and Jung was not about to appear as a fool being hoodwinked by a bunch of spiritualists. And so here he was cautious. But at the same time, he himself, since fairly early in his career, went through a tremendous internal transformation, and the diary records practically of that transformation by his own hand are all contained in the Red Book. And that is why he had said to some of his closer disciples, that's the most important thing that I ever wrote, but we can't publish it because we don't want to be discredited by the academic community. And so it went. So it went until after Jung's death. But by the time C.G. Jung was about to go into the Gnostic pleroma, there were already indications written by others who were close to him and whom he trusted about, let us say, his secret life. And I don't mean his girlfriends, whom he also had. At least he had one very close one. At least I'm sure she got close now and then. The famous Toni Wolff, a great psychologist in her own right. But in any event, it was, let's say, increasingly known that he was on the borderline between the psychical studies, as they were called at that time, parapsychology, which is beyond psychology, on the one hand, and depth psychology, his own depth psychology, the analytical psychology on the other. Now, that being the case, you will not be amazed if I extend the picture a little further, meaning that from the time that he was quite young, he was a partaker of unusual experiences. He didn't talk about those much. But toward the end of his life, when Aniela Jaffe, his then secretary and great admirer, sat at his bedside and wrote down every word that the old gentleman wrote. And the result was Memories, Dreams and Reflections of C.G. Jung, which was published in the 60s. And I'm sorry to tell you if that is in some ways takes a pearl out of the crown, as we used to say in heraldic circles, out of Jung's achievements in other areas. But let us say that is the book that put Jung on the stage. All of a sudden, Jung. And of course it coincided with the 1960s occult revival. So that came together very nicely. And you should have heard already at that time the indignation of many of the Jungian anarchists, many of them now who are swearing about the Red Book like it was the Bible, as to why did Jung have to reveal all of those things to Annie or Jeffrey. Well, he was sick, he was weak, he knew he was going to die, and he felt that there was a personal element of his work, life's work, that obviously had not been out in the open and published, and that it should be available to people. And I think it was a very, very good idea. I used more quotations from that book over the years thereafter, because you don't have to be a professional psychical researcher like my late friend Nando Fodor, whom I have to talk to you from, real good Hungarian gentleman. But let us see, you didn't have to be that much of a specialist, but you could tell by being involved with Jung's method and his books and his lectures and so forth, that this man was walking over the rainbow bridges into the other world like nobody's business. If you didn't want to acknowledge that, if you said, no, he's a scientist, he wouldn't do that, or he wouldn't, And those who read Memories, Dreams and Reflections, of course, knew better. So now, all right, unfortunate as it was, C.G. Jung passed into the greater life, and now the from what I hear, I obviously wasn't there, but the tussle, the game about the Red Book material began, because there were people, some of them commercially minded, some of them purely scholarly minded, who said, look, this has got to be published somehow. There is material here that is of incredibly great interest, and to conceal it only because Jung wouldn't let it published in his lifetime would not be just. Would not be just to Jung, would not be just to his public. So we got to do something about it. And then, of course, along came Dr. Sonu Sandasamy, expert from an expatriate Indian family, very wise man, who, as he told us himself, and I think he wrote it down somewhere too, he was a young man in the 60s, and he was from a Hindu family, so he was about to take off for India to find his guru. And while he was engaged in this pursuit, he was about to get I think his family had money, so while he did not push it very much, but he was about to go to India for this purpose. And as he was, somebody presented him with one of Jung's books. I'm almost certain, but my friends somewhere in the ether will correct me, that it was the wisdom of the golden flower. The translation of the Chinese Taoist scripture, which was sent, I think the translation as well, was sent to Jung by Richard Wilhelm, the great sinologist, which, for your information, means a Chinese scholar, not a scholar of the Sinai Desert or something like that. But anyway, and Jung, of course, also brought forth the theory of synchronicity, which I'll talk about another time. But one little synchronicity occurred to me at that time, which is always the most interesting. What do you care about what happens to other people? But in any event, here I was, and I received the gift makes no difference by whom, but by somebody who was very important to me. I received the gift of an English translation of The Secret of the Golden Flower. It was right about the time, because I checked with him when we were together later, right about the time that Shamdasani was reading The Secret of the Golden Flower, as it is called, in London. And when he read it, he put it down and said, I found my guru. I don't need to go to India. I did not go anywhere. This is the guy. And so Shamdasani became the chief editor and really, you might say, the greatest literary poet of Carl Jung since then. A very interesting and a tremendously devoted and a real philosopher in the sense of somebody who loves wisdom. And he found it in Carl Jung, and he did everything that he could to promote it, to translate it, to edit it, to establish various connections. It very often happens, especially in the occult field, that some prophetic figure like this is there and is writing things. Then he acquires a famous, like Goethe's Faust has his helper, and then that one does a lot of the work. And for instance, the great Jewish heretic who still deserves, I think, a lot more attention, Shabbatai Zvi. Shabbatai Zvi is Zahed. No, Zahed was somebody else. It's Shabbatai Zvi, who was a 17th century Jewish messiah, greatly controversial, because of course he did not respond to the various hallmarks that a messiah is supposed to have. But he was a miracle worker and an absolutely unusual man. And of course, in the end of his life, who am I thinking of now? Oh yeah, Gershon Scholem, the great Jewish scholar and scholar of Jewish mysticism, among his many other works, wrote a book, Shabbatai Zvi, the Mystical Messiah. I can recommend it to anyone. And particularly I can recommend the last few pages. When you read the last few pages, then you can come to me and say, why in the hell made I read you that? And then I can show you. But in any event, Scholem was a very remarkable man himself. In any event, wonderful man. But in any event, now it became more and more, it was sort of leaking out through the battlements of Zurich that we had much more than a mere psychologist, a mere medical doctor here. When he was alive and when he was dead, his influence was a thoroughly transcendental, thoroughly occult one. Now, everything that I did so far is an introduction to my topic. So God have mercy. So I promise you I'll bring it back in greater length at other time. But I'll give you the outline now because I promised and because I think that I owe it to Jung. So Jung let it slip out now and then in his various books that he believed, among many other strange things, in astrology. And that he particularly felt that the ancient system of the zodiacal ages, which last about 2,500 years, give or take, and which go backwards on the zodiac. And I don't need to give you a lesson in astrology, especially since I don't know hardly any astrology myself. But let's say, so was it in this case. And so Jung was interested particularly in the world historical implications of the zodiacal ages, because the progression goes through the zodiac but backwards, and then lasts, give or take, 2,500 years. So Jung had dropped the words quite often, and very justifiably, that we are moving in the direction of a new zodiacal age, and that the Piscean age was coming to an end, and the age of Aquarius was approaching. So, by the way, the people who wrote these burlesque plays, like the one, we had the Aquarius Theatre here where they were singing Aquarius, Aquarius, and all of that. I only went once. That was enough. But let us say it became a buzzword for a period of several years in the 1960s, that yes, the age of Aquarius was coming, and it is something that lasts 2,500 years, where obviously it would last a long time and have a big influence on human history. Now, having to relate it to that subject, right when the Red Book was beginning to be published, the rumor was out that in it was a prophecy in the foretelling sense, and that it had to do with the new age of Aquarius. So, all right, I was talking to my friends, and I was making my notes on the newly published Red Book, for which reason I have, as a gift from a dear friend, I had an access to a first edition of the Red Book. I had access to it, and I saw, well, there is no chapter here that speaks of the future. Or if they even have future in the title, there ain't no future in it. So what did the old Swiss try to do? And then I said, words speak better, pictures speak better than words. And they looked at the front page, the first page of Liber Unus of Liber Novus, the first book of the Red Book, and there is looked like just a nice, because Jung does that. He was very artistic. He would write artistic pictures as like medieval initials in a codex, all kinds of things like that. And there, across the page, so quite a bit, is a picture. And probably somebody in this world must have been as smart or dumb as I and have mentioned it already, but I swear that all the literature that I read about the Red Book, by that time nobody did. And I said, okay, they don't, well, I will. And I can just very, very briefly describe it. It's a long strip on top of a page, and it shows a sort of ongoing scene, starting with the shore of water, and then an extensive body of water with little ships on it and this and that, and some bigger boats further in, and then the other shore of the waters with the houses, obviously Swiss houses, and above this lovely bucolic scene, I don't know what you call a scene about a lake, bucolic, I don't know, but anyway I did. So behind it, where you can see the Alps with the snow-capped there, even higher up, you see the sky. And in the sky is a wide lit-up band of the zodiac. And right about where the reader's eyes would come, there is a shaft of light that projects to one of these, that 12 separate images, that points to one of these images, and it is toward where the sign of Pisces moves away and the sign of Aquarius comes in. He says, here is his secret. Here is he painted it and he put it in the book, and the people are reading and reading the book and they don't see that apparently. In any event, I saw it well. And about that time I was writing my, how many did I write? How many lectures on the Red Book? 30, anyway, quite a lot. And they're on tapes, and they're available. And some of the great Jungian scholars and those who translated the Red Book all read my lectures. I was the first one on this earth who gave a complete series of lectures on Jung's Red Book when it was published in English. So that's enough self-laudation, I would say, but in any way, it was perfectly obvious once we were aware of the symbol message. Here he is. He's looking out over the lake of Zurich, and he's looking up, and this is up there in the sky is the zodiac, and this is what's happening. It's changing, it's moving, it's coming into a new age. So that certainly is enough proof that he did concern himself with this new zodiacal age into which the world obviously has moved, and that some of the material in the books pertains to that. Then when you read the first Liber book, the first book, and so you see that he keeps referring to his own book in terms that indicate that it is prophetic. I am telling you these things because they're going to happen, that sort of thing. I said, oh my God, what a strange situation. And then I kept reading and reading, and yet there is hardly anything that you read in the text that in a direct and translatable way could be called a forecasting until you come to a short chapter. But of course you also have to include the big plate pictures like the Return of Sophia and so forth. Those are all prophetic too. But in this case, what you have is a short chapter in which the prophecy is actually made that the new age is, so to say, coming, and that very short, you really expect a lot of explanation, and that's just what I was reading through it and trying to see, well, okay, so give me some details, Uncle Carl, come on. So finally there are some details, but not too much. And it's like this, that the new era, he has other words for it too, is going to come in 3 portions. And the first of these will be characterized by war. He said to me, so tell me something new. That's all that we have witnessed in world history. In any event, the first is, and he gives some indications of how many years too, but those are very vague. The first war, all right. Then he says the second portion will be characterized by magic. And I said, oh, magic? Oh, wait. I have to take this to the magic castle or something. And then magic, and the third one, religion. And there is very little explanation given for either of these. Now, the reasons for an author doing that sort of thing can be million, and I'm not going to second guess C.G. Jung. I would say that one of the likelihoods is that he felt that if the Red Book falls into hands that he might not wish it to fall, he doesn't want to lay himself completely open. Well, I was a prophet who forecast the future. So he wanted to make it somewhat obscure. And there could be other reasons. Now, and that is, of course, the most portentous of the chapters in certain ways. There are magnificent, poetically written chapters of his own experiences that are fabulous, fabulous. And of course, it shows the transformation, the spiritual growth of a man, of a thinker, and how he wanted to convey this to others, especially when he was no longer there. But let us say, there's not much explanation even of war and magic and religion, although he refers to magic in various ways in other contexts subsequently. So at the time, of course, we thought, including my benighted self, that the war was over. Because the revelation was made. Let's see, when did the Red Book come to America? When we were in Budapest?
2009 is when we were in Budapest?
Yeah. While we were in Budapest, in my rejoicing over the rebirth of my home country, the Jungians were rejoicing over the rebirth of Jung in a museum in New York, which had the original copy of the Red Book, which then eventually also came here. In any event, so I said, well, I have to include the chapter is called Deep Prophecy, so you can't get away from it. That's not the picture. The picture demands your association, your ideation to see what it says. But he says, this says a prophecy. So we all thought, well, sure, war. Yeah, we sure had a couple of them. We just finished another great big one, the World War II, and so forth. So now let's go on to the next one, the magic. Little did we know, at least in my humble estimation, that the war prophesied in the Red Book by Jung hasn't happened yet. So that's a big downer. That's a big downer. Because, I lived through one complete world war. I was born at the termination of an earlier one. You know what, I don't want to deal with another one. But what I want and what happens, that has often had discrepancies in the course of my life. And so there it is also. So in any event, it's hard to tell. But I would say that one has to, among other things, I don't know how I treated it when the first edition was out. And I want you to know, all the translators there was a team of 4 translators, they all listened to my tapes as they were translating. So, it just really, I could explode if I were thus inclined. But in any event, let's say that the war is now. It doesn't have to be a shooting war. Unfortunately, so far, it doesn't have to be a nuclear war. But there is another war. And in fact, there is a war that is more martial, more warlike, I think, than the Cold War, so-called, with the Soviets has ever been. I think this is a rougher war that's going on now than at that time. And that's not a pleasant thought to contemplate. But on the other hand, if there is a mountain lion coming down who intends to come in this door, it's better to be aware of him than not to be aware of him. Bad analogy, but it's the only one that I could think of. So I would say the war is now. And the war is not, except in some places, it's not a shooting war. It is probably, I would say, the main belligerents are China, or the Chi-Coms, as we used to call them, and the United States. But obviously its tentacles reach out into all kinds of things, and there is a very good chance of it spreading and becoming more worthy of being a war than it is at the present time. So anyway, there is a big tussle of big powers who are very capable of annihilating each other and annihilating everybody else, and a very dangerous, nasty situation at the present time. Now, here are the great, and we'll have to conclude on that keynote. So here are the great strange anomalies, because the next period, war, and the next one is magic. So what is that all about? Is magically or magicaloo or beavity babbity boo? Is Walt Disney going to make a new movie of that sort? Of what is that? Well, once again, as I tried to point out, even in my first inadequate interpretation, that we have to have a sense of symbolism. We have to have a sense of all that kind of refined sense of analogy in order to understand something like this. Why? Well, probably because it was written as such. I think Jung had in mind, okay, what if I'm still alive and the analytical psychological movement is going great guns, and they find this book somewhere. He didn't take such terribly good care of it, you know. His son, who is now also deceased, when he was a little boy, read the Red Book in bed. Now, that's some kind of a children's book to read in bed. I wished I grew up in that house in Switzerland. However, I'm thankful for the one that I grew out in as long as it lasted. But let us say you have to use your psyche. You have to use your mind. You have to use your sensation, feeling, thinking, intuition, transcendent function, all of them, if you want to get even a partial understanding of this really strange book. And I would say that when and how the age of magic will manifest, we don't know. But I have such trust in Jung on the basis of my many, many years of studying him that I am sure that he was right. That he was right. And then we are really in another age. But again, how this magic is manifest, the details of it, especially if we are still here on Earth, which I would rather hope not to be, but my hopes have not been observed by Providence very often. So, I would say that in some fashion, from here or from another reality, we will have contact with that next age of magic. And I hope that Jung, who knew so much, would not have used the word magic if it hadn't really been magical. So that apparently an interesting period is coming up. And there have been speculations as to the years. I think the most elaborate speculation that I saw was that it was still about 250 years from the publication date of the Red Book that the new aeon would, so to say, kick in. Now, these are speculations of people, we don't know. But I would say that if one's magical intuition is worth something, I would say that I dearly hope that the age of magic is coming rather rapidly. Why? Because I am sick and tired of the age of war, whether it is done in Haifa or whether it is done in someplace else or on our streets. I am, pardon the expression, I am damn tired of it. Would you like me to add some more expletives? No, I think that that's good to quit at that point. So anyway, and I think I'm not the only one. I am beginning to sense, again, it might be just my imagination, you know, when it's really everything depends on your imagination. And then you say that that's just my imagination. That's a real stupid statement when you make that. So in any event, it could very well be that something that I sense in the air, and not for all that longer time, is not just a disaffection with the present culture and the wars and the things that the demonstrations and the governments and the lack of and things like that are going on, but that it is also, I'm beginning to sense a disgust and a fatigue. I think I'm not the only one who is tired of it all. And we have good reason to be tired, because not to be tired would indicate that we are dumbbells. And none of us likes to be that. You don't want to be a Dummkopf, as they call it in German. So I think that the likelihood is, although this may be just a foreshadowing, you know the way time goes. You think, oh, geez, this is happening now already. And then all of a sudden it stops. And it says, see you next time. You know, because that's the way the psychic world works. It's not here to give you satisfaction. It's here to express what it wants to express. And you should be here to hear it and to understand it and to interpret it properly. So in any event, then I just have to throw in the last one, and I won't comment on it at all. We just have to come back to the Jung prophecy again, because the last one is religion. And since I'm a man of religion, I have been interested in religion all my life. I think it deserves more from me than another 5 minutes. So let us say there's a deepening, sort of a deepening of the psychic perception and of what is going on in the world. First it is great turbulence and mess and death and stupidity, war, and then it is magic, which is now the attention goes through to the mysterious level, to the magical level, to the next steps up. And then finally it goes very deep. And I just say this much about it, not to have left you completely hanging, that there is a design, which I can show you here and which can be copied, it has been copied elsewhere, which Jung, it's a mandala that Jung drew and that he gave the Latin name of Mundi Totius, Systema Mundi Totius, the system of the entire world. And it would be really worthwhile to project it up and then go through the less important parts more quickly. And when it comes to the very end, when the mandala sort of ends, where you would get out of the mandala, not at the center because that is there, but else, is the new God. The new God. that the new religion would have its own God, and Jung even gives him a name, and it is one of the ancient gods, and it is my great, I have it written down. So where are we? I will probably find it while we are drinking coffee. In any event, it is well, let me describe. It's an ancient Greek god who was described as still coming, a coming one. And he comes out of the rocks of the earth. And, well, my goodness, it's here. Here and I read the Greek. You see. But my eyes are not so good either. All right. Well, I will have to come back to you with all, but I have it written out here too. In any event, all that one could deduce at this time, that it carries the symbolism of a coming one, the coming God, the one who isn't here yet, but who is coming. So it's a messianic prediction, and he is just a tiny little design of him made in an oval depiction with wings. But I think the genies are after me. In any event, okay. The top on the mandala, winged figure emerging from the background. It is the Greek god Phanes, Phanes. Very little known, but in the Greek mythology also, the one who is looked for, the one who may come, the one who may set all things right. And Jung puts him down as the God image, every age having its God image of that particular time period. And then, I'm just titillating you now for further lectures. Dr. Shamdasani, while going through all of Jung's material, has also come up with what almost accounts for an immense litany that Jung wrote, which is all extolling Phanes. It's the most, it's hundreds of words, one after the other, and they all describe Phanes in his glory, in his light, in his compassion, in his goodness, in his wisdom. It's on and on and on and on. I couldn't read it to you here because you will all walk out. But I will, in the only place so far where I have found that one. This, of course, is in this coffee table book. Very nice depiction of the whole mandala. But that one about the new God is in what is called the reader's edition of the Red Book. It is a smaller edition, no illustrations, but on the other hand, quite a bit more footnoting material and commentaries by Shamdasani, which are very valuable, and he has found this passage with all this incredible ecstatic extolling. I mean, it's like Saint Teresa of Avila writing about Jesus. It was fabulous. It goes on and on and on and on. I said, well, this man really had an experience because nobody else would be able to write this sort of thing. So let's say he even predicted the God image, which would have a great deal of influence on the development of the new religion, but not much more about it. So these are supposed to be the three divisions then. The war, the magic, and the religion. So if you're confused, don't feel alone, because I was when I read it first and I still am. Although here and there something happens in the world that reminds you, well, maybe this fits into the picture. But this is the prophecy of the Red Book, And I do think that Jung was a prophet. I also think that he did not cherish the role of being a predicting prophet, because this is really the only explicit temporal prophecy in the Red Book. All the other things are different. So I don't think that he particularly enjoyed being a Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, or any of those old boys. And I don't blame him, because the Old Testament prophets on the whole are not very attractive characters. They are not people you would want to go to dinner with, most of them. And maybe that's just my prejudice, but I'm a pro-Palestinian and pro-Jewish, you better believe it, but I am not pro-Old Testament prophets, not most of them. So let's say that's all no great importance. But let's say there is a rather definite temporal prophecy there. It was made by Jung, and it requires further inquiry, and maybe we'll do a little bit of that inquiry here, but do try to keep in your mind that the important thing in life is not the future. The important thing in life is now. Because if you can get hold of these powers and these forces and this magnificence of farness now, then the future is assured forever and forever. If you can't get hold of it, then it is not. So don't look forward to me coming forth with an interpretation of farness that will be tremendously wild, although it could be done, but you may wish to keep in mind war, magic, and religion. And then see what kind of atmosphere, what kind of situation this may conjure in your own imagination, and then probably you will come close to it. Because after all, Jung said that the Gnostics knew the psyche and was speaking from the psyche, and so was he. And for that reason, these are all revelations that come from deeply within, and that when properly handled can be useful. I hope our being here together has also been useful. I am a little bit in one of my shakier moods today. Please take a look at this mandala, and this is one place in this book. I think it's probably out of print. The good prints, the good books that you want are always out of print. This is always, but we have something new, it's going to be issued next week. But I don't want that one, I want this one. But that's how things go. In any event, once we have this in a way that we can all see it, owing to my familiarity, particularly with Jung's 7 sermons, I can easily explain the various figures and their location there, just a basic understandable manner. Anyway, thank you very, very much, and take a look at our new flyer, and I promise you that it will also be quite interesting and always converging, of course, with what we have been done, because we are devoted to the esoteric tradition, we are devoted to the real theosophy, the real wisdom of the gods. And with the help of the gods, we shall attain to some of that wisdom, so mote it be.